Council held its annual convention recently in Los Angeles, focusing on what it means to be a Muslim American. This portion of the convention is 2 hours.
Good morning, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. May the peace and blessings of God be upon all of you. Thank you all for joining us for our 10th annual MPAC convention. This year is unlike any other year that we've had with the convention. We are trying an innovative new format in response to the requests, the suggestions, and the recommendations of previous attendees of our convention. So we're very excited about the day that we have planned. And before we get started with that program, and I tell you a little bit more about what's coming up, I would like to introduce Aziza Hasan, who is our Southern California Government Relations Director, who will be offering a brief recitation from the Holy Quran.
Assalamu alaikum. May peace and God's blessings be upon you all. I will be reciting from Surah al-Ma'idah, which is chapter 5, verse 48. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وأنزلنا إليك الكتاب بالحق مصدقا لما بين يديه من الكتاب ومهيمنا عليه فاحكم بينهم بما أنزل الله ولا تتبع أهواءهم عما جاءك من الحق لكل جعلنا منكم شرعة ومنهاجا ولو شاء الله لجعلكم أمة واحدة لكن ليبلوكم فيما آتاكم فاستبقوا الخيرات إلى الله مرجعكم جميعا فينبئكم بما كنتم فيه تختلفون صدق الله العظيم. I seek refuge with God from Satan. To thee we sent the scripture in truth, confirming the scripture that came before it and guarding it in safety. So judge between them by what God hath revealed, and follow not their vain desires, diverging from the truth that hath come to thee. To each among you have we prescribed a law and an open way. If God had so willed, he would have made you a single people. But his plan is to test you with what he hath given you. So strive in a race of all virtues. The goal of you all is to God. It is he that will show you the truth of matters in which ye dispute. God speaks the truth.
Thank you. So, it's our 10th annual convention. For 10 years, we've been gathering together as a community to hold this convening, which means that we have been making an attempt over the years to bring our community together, in addition to our interfaith allies, our civic partners, our government partners, and beyond, in order to hold much-needed conversations about the timely and often the controversial issues of the day that are impacting not only the Muslim American community, but America at large. And we have always operated on the belief that we must have vibrant, candid conversations along both of those channels simultaneously, and that we must find ways to fuse those two conversations because they are inherently related. For that reason, today we are conducting our convention in a unique format. We are having 2 back-to-back roundtable sessions, like you see the first one collected in front of us here already, on 2 timely subjects. And we have expanded the length of these sessions in order to allow for a rich, candid, and open conversation to take place between our panelists and also with you here in our audience and beyond. The beyond aspect takes care of 2 things, which is that first, that we are being recorded here today by C-SPAN, and the proceedings will be aired on C-SPAN before the end of the year, within the next 2 weeks. So you can refer your friends and family and contacts to that. And then beyond that, we also are doing a live webcast. So our folks here at the table are right now taking questions and comments from people not just around the country, but around the world, I've been told already that we have people who are logged in from 8 different countries and at least 13 states. So the conversation takes place within this room and beyond. And so part of what will happen today is that in addition to the questions that you submit to our panelists and those offered by our moderators, we'll also be taking questions from the webcast, from indeed around the world today. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about why we selected our theme for this year, which is the struggle for America's conscience. In light of all that has taken place this year, and if you close your eyes and think back to what a roller coaster of a year it has been for the Muslim community and for America at large, we have been through some struggles that involve race, religion, identity, challenges of integration, questions of whether we will be an exclusive country or an inclusive country, questions of immigration, of radicalization, of the future of our country, of Congress, of the two-party system, new parties, and beyond. Not to mention issues around the economy and ongoing questions around jobs and beyond. These issues are impacting all of us on different levels, and that's precisely why we're here to talk about them. Because we cherish the pluralism, the diversity of our country, and the place that each of us have in creating a vibrant and healthy and a serious debate and a conversation. And that's what today is, one long, or at least 2 long conversations. So with that, I will turn it over to Salam al-Marayati, the president of MPAC, who will moderate our first session. And we will begin. Oh, sorry, one housekeeping item that I should mention is that our request is that if you can keep the center aisle clear because of the cameras in the back, so if you can use the side aisles as you're moving around. And there are water stations in the back for anybody who needs refreshments. So with that, I'll turn it over to Salam.
Thank you very much, Edina. Thank you all for joining us for this very important conversation. The conversation is entitled The State of Our Union, Race, Religion, and American Identity. And for some decades, we have seen various efforts of groups to raise issues that are considered to be revolutionary intellectually and politically. There was the movement of Barry Goldwater. There was Newt Gingrich's movement with the Contract for America. There have been a number of groups associated with Ronald Reagan that have talked about bringing in more fiscal responsibility for our country. And lately, there has been the Tea Party movement that really, I think our panelists can talk a little bit about that, but the questions that arise from this Tea Party movement are of note and of interest to us today. In particular, the concern over having an African-American president and the response to it. There's an interesting poll that we were discussing before our session commenced today, that 40% of people on the right believe that the president is a Muslim. And this kind of perception that is out there has in some ways driven the sentiment that our country is under attack, and there's the theme of it's time to take our country back. Another issue is this sense that there is discrimination against the majority. And therefore, the Shirley Sherrod case, the woman involved, African-American woman, who was fired based on statements that were attributed to her that were later retracted, and an apology was given by the Secretary of Agriculture for firing her. And also, there is the SB 1070 case in Arizona that involves immigration and really a kind of scrutiny and a kind of measure that is invasive in terms of people's private lives and identity. And so this kind of xenophobia is affecting all of us. And we have said at the Muslim Public Affairs Council, Islamophobia is just part of the chain of xenophobia in America. It is an American problem. It is not a Muslim problem. And so for that reason, we have assembled this very distinguished panel to have a conversation about the issues of race, identity, and pluralism. Where is our pluralism today? Are we seeing something that we've never seen in our country, or is this part of the process in terms of integration in terms of pluralism throughout American history. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting from my far right, but definitely not politically on the far right. Angela O is the executive director of the Western Justice Center. And the Western Justice Center is involved in conflict resolution. And it brings different parties, different groups to the center for very candid discussions about race, about identity, about pluralism. And some of you may know that Angela also became a very outspoken figure during the 1992 unrest in Los Angeles and was really part of the healing process in Los Angeles. Next to her is Rashad Hussain. Rashad is President Barack Obama's envoy to the Organization of Islamic Conference. He is formally also the Deputy Associate Counsel to the President. And he has received his Juris Doctorate from Yale University and has been engaged with several conversations here and abroad on the status of Muslim Americans and on U.S. policy towards the Muslim world. Next to him is Fernando Guerra. Fernando and I actually had the privilege of going to the Vatican together on an interfaith trip sometime back in the 90s. He is the director for the Center for the Study of Los Angeles and follows demographic shifts, polling, public opinion, and is a pollster, I believe, for some political groups. To my left is Reem Salahi. She is a civil rights attorney, has done some post 9/11 discrimination cases in coordination with the ACLU, and is also involved with a number of young Muslim groups throughout Southern California, and has been a speaker in many Islamic centers on that issue in terms of the sentiment coming from young Muslim Americans. To her left is Pastor Bob Roberts. He is the founding pastor of the NorthWood Church in Dallas, Fort Worth. And coming from an evangelical background, Bob Roberts has been at the forefront of dialogue with Muslims, both here in the United States and abroad. And finally, we have Reverend Madison Shockley. Madison, also, I think we got to know each other after the 92 unrest.
Well, before that.
And even before that with the Gulf War.
Right, exactly.
And in terms of the peace coalition that we were working on back in the early 90s. I think 1990 and 1991. Madison is the pastor of Pilgrim United Church of Christ in Carlsbad, California. He's also on the board of directors of the Interfaith Community Services in San Diego County. Now, I have made my introductions of our panelists very brief. If you would like to know more about them, you can always Google their names. And definitely when we Google, we find out not only what we want to say about ourselves, but what our political opponents want to say about us. So have at it. As I said, this is going to be a conversation. And then we're going to have a brief conversation here on the stage, and then we'll turn to you and people on the web who can also ask questions to continue the conversation. I want to start with Fernando. You know, in terms of the Tea Party movement, as I stated earlier, there seems to be this concern of anti-white discrimination, that Muslims and African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans are getting preferential treatment, and therefore there's a strong grievance that is driving a lot of what's happening in the Tea Party movement. And interesting to note, two of the more far to the right, if you will, candidates in Nevada and New Jersey lost, but it's still a phenomenon. Can we describe what is happening politically in terms of public sentiment that's driving some of these views from the Tea Party movement?
Yeah, it's not unusual that when you have economic dislocation, when you have vast movements of populations, immigration, migration within the United States, people get displaced and they become uncomfortable with what is happening, and they look to return to a romanticized past. And they romanticize that past as being economically very well off, socially stable, and they associate that with white Christian America. Now, nothing could be further from the truth, but people are very selected in terms of how they view America's past. America has always been diverse in terms of clearly the Native Americans. But even if you take a look at here in Los Angeles, which at one time was one of the whitest cities ever enumerated in the census, it was also started by a very diverse population. The original settlers of 1781 were of African, of European, of obviously of North American origin, and all those type of mixtures. But there is that response. Interestingly enough, the narrative in the past election, especially after we take a look at the results, was the tremendous Republican victories that occurred in the House. And a lot of that attributed to the Tea Party. The second narrative was how that incredible wave stopped really in the western states. Nevada, Colorado, the state of Washington, all elected or re-elected Democratic senators, where many expected that a Republican might win. And then, of course, the whole California story, where not a single Tea Party candidate for a partisan office won in California. And as a matter of fact, Democrats overwhelmingly won. And as contrast, you mentioned Newt Gingrich and the Contract for America in 1994, very similar wave. In 1994, you have to recall that the Republicans in California captured 4 of the 7 statewide offices, including the gubernatorial election. They captured several congressional offices. They captured the state assembly, and they also passed Proposition 187. And so many people compare 2010 and 1994 as very similar, and it's true nationally, but at the state level in California, nothing could be further from the truth. It actually was, California was very different. And why is California different? It's the diversity and the degree to which we are comfortable with it. Even to the extent that you talked about polling, I've been tracking polling at the city of Los Angeles and at the state of California nationally. But even whites in California, including Republicans, are much more tolerant of different groups, specifically Latinos, African Americans, in terms of winning public office than ever before. And because they're comfortable and they're aware of the situation in California. As the country becomes more comfortable with that, I believe you'll have less movements than the Tea Party tends to try to create that environment. The Tea Party was a significant player, but I would, in terms of some of the analysis that I've done, I would not attribute any really true Republican victories to the Tea Party. In other words, I believe that many Republicans would have won those seats that Tea Party Republicans won, for whether it's Kentucky or different places. As a matter of fact, one could attribute the loss that for instance, Delaware or in Nevada, where clearly the Republicans should have won, and probably would have won had they not nominated Tea Party activists. So the Tea Party, I think, hurt and actually prevented the Republicans from capturing more seats than they would have had there just been a typical, like a 1994 type of an election. And I'll stop there for the moment.
Well, Angela, Fernando gave an excellent analysis of what's happening politically. What's happening at the grassroots level? What's the sentiment of various groups in response to some of these sentiments that are coming from xenophobic groups?
I want to remind everyone that we are in a place in time where we understand discrimination and racism to manifest itself at 3 very distinct levels: at the individual level, at the institutional level, and then at the structural level. So at the grassroots, on the individual level, for example, at the Western Justice Center, we do a lot of education. We believe that that's the only vehicle, really. And we focus a lot on children because they're the future, not to sound cliche, but in fact, that is where we put a lot of our energy. We work with school districts, and, there is a skill to doing conflict resolution work. It is not just understanding the concepts. Our mission is to displace the power of violence in society. That's a huge mission. What does that even mean? And it's no longer a time when people are comfortable with intra-group organizing only. For example, the problem of structural racism can only really be addressed if white people begin to educate white people. I mean, the social and cultural distance is not as great. Great, you can go to other parts of the country and other parts of the world to try to set things right. Try doing it in your own backyard. Try to do it in your own family, okay? So these are challenges we're starting to put out. Conflict resolution, listening, really listening, not just with your ears, but your whole being, is the hardest soft skill that you're going to ever learn. We work with police officers. We work with gang-involved youth. We work with schools, both at the teacher level and the student level. We will work with parents who are at a loss about what to do when their child comes home and has been, made fun of or humiliated or bullied. We are trying constantly to do innovations in this space. But people are not easily able to embrace change. Change was what you saw the rallying cry to be a few years ago. And, of course, change is really difficult. People don't really want it. I used to use an example. In New York, they changed some of the area codes for phone numbers. It created such a disruption that it made the front page of the New York Times. If people can't even deal with area code changes, how are they going to be dealing with the changes in their communities, with cultural changes, with political shifts, with a new voice emerging? So we just heard that the DREAM Act wasn't passed this week. The Senate rejected it after the Congress, the House, passed it. The lives of so many young people who, through no fault of their own, are put in this really, gray space. And how are they going to negotiate those waters? I mean, they're not empowered to do so in a political way. They're not empowered to do so, through their position economically leveraging things. But they're going to continue to organize. And those voices will not be silenced. They will continue to be heard. And more, I think there will be a groundswell. As far as the Tea Party is concerned, I think it's very important that we learn from what happened here, because this is a ramp up to 2012. There is going to be a huge challenge to the current administration for all of the reasons that you're discussing here over the next day. And that ramp up began more than a year ago when we were running up to this year's elections. The demographic data that are coming out this year, along with the experiences, now we've identified who the players are in the Tea Party who are going to mobilize nationally. We've identified what their messages are. We have identified what the infrastructure looks like. There is a lot of work going on right now. And 2012, just for those of you who follow the Chinese calendar, and you don't have to believe it, it's just, thousands of years old and billions of human beings that have come up with this. But in 2012, we are talking about the year of the dragon. It's a significant year. Next year is the year of the rabbit. You know what rabbits are like. That's what the energy will be next year. But the year of the dragon is 2012.
Okay. Well, with rabbits, dragons, and demographics, let's turn to Texas. Bob, you're from Texas. Do you see the same thing coming from your neck of the woods, or is it a different assessment altogether?
I think most people know that Texas is an overwhelmingly Democratic state, and so as a result of that, we have more liberal views than most places in the country. No, I would say I don't think you can position the current conversation in the world around Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and liberals. That's a previous generation's way of defining the world that, frankly, I belong to, but when I look at people like Rashad and Reem that are coming into the forefront, I honestly believe that the world that we're inheriting is a radically different world. And so as a result of that, continuing to try to define our culture and our world just in those two terms is not going to cut it. I'm not a researcher like you are, Fernando, but I work with young pastors in America. We start many churches. I work with young people that are volunteering all over the world, engaging the world. And the reason President Obama was elected is because young white evangelicals were one of the groups that helped put him in office. It wasn't just the Democratic Party turning out. Had there not been evangelicals that were behind him, that were supporting him, that were promoting him, he never would have, I believe, made it to office. I believe that we know that the world is shifting. It's a scary world. Change is right around the corner, and we don't have the right templates or paradigms for understanding the current world that we face. So as a result of that, you're going to see a lot of tea parties. I don't know what it'll be in the Democratic Party, maybe the Moose Party. I don't know. But you're going to see multiple parties, and I think you're going to see the rise in the next few years of even third parties, of people that are trying to figure out how do we take the 21st century and make it work. A lot of the leaders, if you read one of the magazines I just read is talking about the baby boomers are now entering retirement. And so what is it going to look like for the busters, the Gen Xers, and then the millennials that are coming along? I think that there's a sense in Texas that we feel because of the metropolitan areas of Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Austin, and Houston. It's no longer much like people would perceive it, this big wide area. For example, Dallas, Fort Worth, 44% of the population are new Americans. Right. New Americans. There are over 228 languages spoken in Dallas. 1975, there was one mosque. Today, there are 43 mosques in the Metroplex. Multiple temples. In my community alone, the suburb that I'm in, we have a mosque, we have a Buddhist temple, we have churches, we have a synagogue. It's all present. And not everyone goes to those. So I think the world that we are living in right now has shifted. We're all connected. And the biggest problem is we don't know how to talk to one another. And there's no privacy anymore, which I think is a wonderful thing in one sense, because it forces all of us to have one conversation. And what Ms. O said is incredibly true. We don't know how to talk among our own tribe. I bring greetings to my cousins that are Muslims. I love you guys. I've come to know you over the last several years from around the world. But my biggest challenge, frankly, is not loving Muslims or Jews or Buddhists or anyone else. My biggest challenge is not getting crucified by my own tribe. That's right. For loving people of a different tribe. And I've met Muslims who face the same thing. It's real interesting. The largest mosque, the largest synagogue in our church came together. And you need to understand, I'm an evangelical. I don't know if you understand what that means, but it's the more conservative Christian. So it's not a big thing for mainline or more liberal churches to reach out to other groups. But for a conservative evangelical church, it is. And me and the rabbi and the imam brought our congregations together in January. And not just us, but our congregation. So on Friday we all went to the synagogue, ate kosher desserts, watched their worship, and then the imam and rabbi and I took Q&A. Next day we did the exact same thing at the mosque. Sunday we did the exact same thing at our church. It was a pretty incredible experience. But what we all three learned from that is our biggest challenge was our own tribes. From the rabbi to the imam to myself. It was fascinating because here I am as an evangelical, a passionate believer in religious freedom, writing blogs, supporting the mosque being built, Park 51, while the imam is saying, let's realize where we are, let's be patient, every other religious group. So, we were arguing one another's cases with one another's tribes without realizing that. So I just think what's made complicated is everything is present. Everything. We're connected. So if I want to know what Muslims think about me, all I have to do is go to the Muslim websites. All I've got to do is Google Islamic Dawah, and you can Google Christian Great Commission. And you can know anything you want about anybody. The problem is we have a lot of smart people. They don't know how to speak with one voice in a global conversation in a clear way where people can understand them. That's what's not happening.
Thank you, Bob. Madison, how does it look from your lens in terms of these kinds of issues in terms of what's happening in the progressive field?
Well, I first want to commend you for the theme of this conference and for the theme of this panel and those that you have gathered, because this is the kind of conversation that needs to take place not just here but throughout this country.
It takes Muslims to have these people brought together.
That's it.
Thank you very much.
And it highlights the point I want to start with, and what Pastor Roberts just said. The problem right now is that there's no place to have a conversation. There's no common ground. There's no common language. Words mean different things to different people. And most importantly, there's no common set of facts that can adjudicate that conversation. Everyone's operating out of their own set of facts. I'm in a unique cross-cultural position, a black pastor of a predominantly white Anglo congregation. We're getting more diverse, but it's still probably, 85% white in a very white part of California. So excuse me, Fernando, it doesn't look as diverse from where I sit in North County, San Diego. In North County, San Diego, we have Escondido that opposed the mosque being built there. We have housing laws that would prevent landlords from renting to undocumented persons. It was overturned, but it was passed in the city. We have Vista, California, where they are harassing day laborers, assuming everyone's undocumented and imposing these regimes that just make it hard to live. And there's this kind of paranoia just in the air about people who are different that is shocking to me, having moved from Los Angeles with a whole different atmosphere to North County, San Diego. And when I listen to my members, who are for the most part very liberal, progressive people, they are brother and sister and cousin, literally, to members of the Tea Party. Yeah. And that's what's so enlightening, to see that even among the white community, there's not a place for a conversation. And they get all these emails with all this madness and craziness, and they simply sometimes just shut down the conversation within their own families. When I moved there in 2004, it was in May, and as the first holidays came around, I got a number of my members who were coming to me after the election in which Bush was reelected, and they said, "Oh, I have to go to Thanksgiving. I can't stand it." I said, "What do you mean you can't stand Thanksgiving?" "I have to talk to my right-wing brother-in-law at dinner that day." And this is simply continued. But I think in this moment, and what's so important about the title of this conference, about the conscience of America, and this panel, American Identity, you've nailed it. Do not neglect this talk within the Tea Party and beyond about American exceptionalism. That drives their worldview. And American exceptionalism has taken a beating in the last 4 or 5 years. And the major beating it's taken was the election of President Barack Obama, who refused in their terms to accede to this political ideology, this political theology of American exceptionalism. So when he refused to accede to their understanding of that, and then you get the statistics that you mentioned earlier, and there's a lot of overlap, that 40% of Republicans or right-wingers or whomever feel that President Obama was not born in the United States and therefore is not the legitimate president of the United States, because electing him was a major psychic shift in this country. Because the president serves not only as the executive, but also the head of state, and therefore the symbol of the nation. And they were frankly used to looking at a white male as the symbol of our nation that holds it all together. So everything underneath can be going wrong and wild. It'll all get settled out because there's a white man at the top. But when that was changed, and that image was changed, profound, I believe, psychological harm was done to many who clung to that ideology. And so now you have set in a kind of mass hysteria, and that says the president is not the duly elected president, that he is a Muslim, and as well at the same time a radical Christian, formerly belonging to my denomination, the United Church of Christ, And there is no way to engage people in a reasonable fashion about how we move forward. So the mosque or the Islamic Center in New York, why that was such a controversy was because of the feeling of impotence that those who adhere to American exceptionalism have. 9/11 was the first strike. It was an exposure of America's vulnerability. Because we had this image that, the rest of the world was subject to these things, but we weren't. We were impermeable. So therefore, the strike on 9/11 exposed the vulnerability. And then the impotence to do anything about it is what's driving this madness. And so the idea that a Muslim congregation could erect a building on what they call ground zero when their own impotence has failed to erect their own monument. So it's not, I think it would be a different thing if the monument of 9/11 had already been constructed. But that is a sign to them of this rise of Islam. And they see it, even though Muslims are such an infinitesimal proportion of the society, they see it as a threat because the person at the very top, the President of the United States, in their mind, is a secret Muslim who has this conspiracy of cooperation with international Islam to take over the United States. And so everything connected to that poses this disproportionate threat to anything and everything they do. That's why it doesn't have to be at Ground Zero. It can be in Chattanooga, Tennessee, or Escondido. It represents the ascendancy of Islam in what they view as an exclusively Christian nation. And the sad thing about mass hysteria is that it's not subject to medication or other typical treatments.
Well, on that note, Rashad, you travel throughout the world. Europe obviously has a very different structure from the United States. But some people feel like we are approaching the way Europe is structured in terms of having the power held by the few, the exceptional, and the rest of us are visitors. Tell us a little bit about the structure in Europe, how it relates to the United States, and how you see things changing here in America.
Well, before I do that, I'll just back up a little bit and say that in our work with creating partnerships with people all over the world, including Muslims, we're really focusing on moving forward in a way that emphasizes what we share in common, emphasizes our similarities, what the President termed as mutual interest and mutual respect, going back to his landmark address in Cairo. And it's not focused so much on differences that we have politically, racially, ethnically. And when we talk about these issues, what we're constantly saying is that when you look at Muslim communities, you look at Muslims, we should understand that Muslim people share the same fundamental concerns, share the same fundamental aspirations as everyone else. So when we engage in these conversations, the first topic of discussion shouldn't necessarily be issues of security or the controversies of the day regarding the building of mosques. Because on a day-to-day basis, what Muslims are worried about are jobs, just like everyone else. They're worried about education for themselves, for their families. They're worried about taking care and supporting their families. They're worried about health care for their families. And that's not only true in the United States, but in around the world. So in our work in partnering with Muslim communities and other communities, it's important that we work in a way which creates initiatives and partnerships in entrepreneurship to deal with issues like the economy, for example, in science and technology, in health, and in other areas as well. And that's not to say that there aren't very important political issues that have been sources of tension between the United States and Muslim communities around the world. But it's important that we realize that those aren't the only issues by which we engage Muslim communities. And I think for far too long, when people think of Muslim communities around the world, think of Muslims immediately, those hot-button issues come to mind. So I wanted to take a step back first and say that our approach is different. It's to engage people based on what we all share. Now, of course, there are real issues, there are real concerns, and those are the issues that tend to get the bulk of the headlines, more so than creating partnerships in maternal and child health or the eradication of polio or entrepreneurship. And there's no doubt that the concerns are real, but there's also another powerful narrative that's building. If you look at some of these controversies, such as the controversy regarding the proposed burning of the Quran. Here was a case in which an individual with a congregation probably 10 times smaller than the amount of people in this room here came up with an idea that was rejected immediately by other evangelicals in Florida. The city of Gainesville denied a permit to go forward with that activity, and it was condemned by people on the left and the right. So you also have the narrative of people coming together. A month or a couple of months later, a press conference of major leaders from all religious faiths, all ethnicities, all races coming together and condemn some of the sentiment that has been seen in parts of the country. Pastor Roberts mentioned Dallas, where I came from. When I was growing up there was one mosque. When you talk about opposition to building of mosques, now there's 43 mosques in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And on the issue of Europe, which you raised, there's polling data that shows, for example, on the issue of the headscarf, that Americans overwhelmingly reject restrictions on religious freedom and what individuals can and cannot wear being implemented by the government. So I do think that there are areas of serious concern, which are the ones that we've focused on. But I also think it's important to understand that there is another narrative that's also building, and even an issue like Ground Zero. When we spoke about Ground Zero, it wasn't that Muslims were somehow the exception, but it was very much in the context of just like Christians have the right to build a church, just as Hindus have the right to build a temple and Jewish people have the right to build a synagogue, Muslims too have the right to build their places of worship. So our approach is one that focuses on areas of mutual interest and mutual respect and what brings us together. And I think that there's very powerful allies of that way of thinking as well that have also emerged in the last couple of years.
Reem, you talk to a lot of young people, and there are times when I read from young people of all backgrounds, and they just don't get a sense that their American identity is very strong. And that may affect our pluralism. Do you get that sense from talking to various young groups? We'll talk about Muslims in particular later, but just in terms of what you see out there, in terms of identity, what you see out there in terms of civil rights in this particular era.
Well, I think for me, I can speak a lot more about the Muslim community specifically, just because that's where I've worked. A lot of my work has been based in the Muslim community. And while I appreciate what Rashad is saying, there is definitely this sense of nativism in America that has caused a lot of Muslim youth to feel very ostracized and to feel targeted. And a lot of times that targeting, they feel the targeting is not just coming from their peers, but is also coming from the government above, which makes it very, very difficult for them to feel American and to feel connected to that sense of Americanism. One thing that really is very striking is the way that Muslims are portrayed in the media. And, while a lot of Muslim youth and a lot of Muslims see the media as not necessarily reflective of the truth, there is a point where it becomes consumed and they begin to see themselves through the lens of the way the media portrays them. And so in the media, a lot of times when we read and hear about Muslims, they're divided into three classes. There's the passive Muslims who pray and read Quran and are just the good Muslims. Then there's the financiers of terrorism, and then there's the terrorists themselves. And so it's completely stripped of any humanism. Muslims are completely stripped of the sense of just being Americans and being humans. And so that is something that's becoming more and more difficult, particularly now where there is a focus on homegrown terrorism and this whole idea of lone wolves, where you have people like the kid in Portland, Oregon, and the youth in Baltimore who were basically tried to engage in these terrorist actions through the prodding of the FBI. And this continued rhetoric and this continued conflation of Islam and terrorism and American Muslims and terrorism, which is becoming extremely problematic and very threatening to a lot of Muslim youth who are becoming more and more isolated and feeling more and more under attack. And also because has become the discourse and the understanding of a lot of Americans throughout this country where Muslims are seen as the other. And so there is tremendous increase in bullying and harassment in schools. One thing that's really interesting, when both you and I went to Temecula, the mosque, Madison was talking about the mosque out there, just hearing a lot of the rhetoric that has come out that's been is uncensored. Hearing about how a flag is going to be flying, a Sharia flag is going to be flying over the White House. This was in front of a planning commission. Just hearing the uncensored comments it was shocking to me. It was shocking that this has become acceptable and that there is no sense of need to censor that rhetoric, which for many Muslims, including youth and including individuals like myself, it does create this sense of ostracization and this sense of fear and wanting to be American, but really feeling rejected in many ways from being American.
Well, we're going to come back to that in terms of, in particular, what's happening with young Muslims. But I want to go back to Fernando. Today, the Senate voted on the DREAM Act, and it failed. And so there's going to be no immigration reform for the time being. So could we also extract from that the sense that there's a large community here in the United States that doesn't feel like they belong?
No. I mean, what we're talking about is exclusion, and then we're talking about how do we get previously excluded groups to be included in the political, social, religious life of America. And this is one case where, and part of the problem is that we conflate, if we were just simply to talk about the DREAM Act and getting young kids who were brought here very young, who are immigrants, still undocumented, have done everything that American society says you should do to be an American. They are the epitome of what it is to be American. And yet they are not American. And this really, to me, is something that I live with at university, at Loyola Marymount University, where I teach. I have several of these kids, and I know several of them at USC and Cal State Northridge and different places, where they have been incredibly successful and done everything that has been asked of them. But yet, when they graduate, they cannot do and get a job because of they are undocumented. The vote was 55 in favor, 41 against. Now, most of us would say, wait a minute, that's a majority, that should pass. But in the Senate rules, they needed 60 votes to create closure and actually bring it for a vote. And of the 55 who voted in favor of the DREAM Act, 52 were Democrats and 3 were Republicans. Of the 41 who voted against it, I think all but 4 or 5 were Republicans. So there was a partisan aspect to it. And from the Republican Party, they were convoluting this with all kinds of different politics and all different messages, and some of them talking about comprehensive immigration reform. But the reality here is they had a moment to talk about America's conscience, to talk about America inclusion, to talk about the best and the brightest that we have out there and bring them into American society. And they failed. They failed. And I'm ashamed for what has happened and how we convoluted this issue. And it's going to hurt thousands of kids today. This is not a theoretical issue. Today, there are tens of thousands of kids whose lives could have completely and totally changed. American kids. Okay? Yes, they may not be U.S. citizens, but they were raised here. They have every single American value. They are not Mexican, or they are not Canadian or European or African, because they didn't grow up there. And they cannot go back because they have no place to go back. Most of them don't even speak the language of where their origin is, or don't speak it very well. And we've just abandoned these kids here in our midst. And I got to tell you, it is something that made me pessimistic today. I'm usually optimistic. I do believe that race relations have gotten better, and we track that from public opinion poll. I do believe, like Madison talked about these different incidences in Orange County and other parts of California, we have to be vigilant against anti-Muslim, anti-religious, anti-Mexican issues. Constantly we have to be vigilant, but overall things have gotten better. The progression of American liberalism and inclusion, whether it's the African American or women or Latinos, and it will include, and it's been including Muslims, it will happen, but there's always times when we stall a little bit, go back. And I think sometimes when we're in an era where we've stalled or gone back, we get a little bit pessimistic. And I'm pessimistic today.
Angela?
I'm not. I'm not pessimistic. So I just want to try this out. If you clasp your hands like this, all of you, and just, you don't have to raise your hand yet, but just look at your hands. And again, you don't have to buy it. It's only thousands of years and billions of people that we've observed. So they say that people who have their left thumb over their right thumb tend to be people of the heart. Okay? The people who have their right thumb over their left thumb tend to be people who are more of reason. So, and it's very uncomfortable for people who are one to clasp their hand the other way. It's not natural for them. So you don't need to raise your hands about this, but I would guess that about half are the left thumb and about half are the right thumb. So I'm going to preface my remarks so you keep in check your tendency. Okay? So yes, the Senate rejected the DREAM Act. They also repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell. What does that tell us politically? And I don't play politics anymore. I used to. But I decided the system is so broken and corrupt that I really cannot. And I have to thank, with all sincerity, people like this young man who has the wherewithal to step right into the most powerful political office in the world, which I played with for a short amount of time back in the 90s, the late 90s. It's an office that thinks it covers all of its contingencies every day. It runs 24/7, and inevitably, every 24-hour cycle, there is an emergency, which, if the American people, or any people, frankly, knew, that we could spin into crisis out of panic. But they handle it. It's an incredible office. Okay. So Don't Ask, Don't Tell gets passed. What is the political dynamic that occurs in Congress with human beings? Politicians are not gods. They are just people who have to ask for money and who have to understand what it takes to get what they want to accomplish as a politician. And so there was a trade made somewhere, and we'll never know where unless WikiLeaks finds a memo. And we will be able to understand, if you step back just a minute, that there was a negotiation that went on at some level, that I will give you immigration, or I will give you Don't Ask, Don't Tell in exchange for immigration this time around. And somehow we will revisit this issue because it's inevitable, because we know that there are forces out there that will bring it up again and again and again. And nobody's going to ever be happy, and people who really play understand politics. This is the thing. So we have some of the American people who are very powerful politically who are happy today because Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. And then we have others in the American body politic who are very sad today. I don't happen to agree that it's as tragic because I already have in my mind many things that these young people can be doing, which I will be having separate conversations at universities in the next quarter about what the other options are, which are much more productive, in my opinion, in reality. And it is true what our pastor said here from Texas, that, everything is happening now. And if you don't understand that, you should read Eckhart Tolle about the power of now. It's not to say that the history doesn't matter. You carry it. It's in you. It's present now. Nor is it to say that the future doesn't matter or we can't do something about it. because what you do now will have a certain effect on the future, but it is now. And we live in an extraordinary time where the transparency is so tremendous that even the Secretary of State has to go on the airwaves and protest the terrible thing that WikiLeaks, the despicable thing that WikiLeaks has done. And yet there's an analysis that says, you know, transparency may be the thing, the next big change that all of us have to accept. And what are the implications of that? I mean, if you ponder that for just even a few minutes, it's quite extraordinary what could be happening. So for me, when I look at the situation, every generation feels it lives in the worst of times and the best of times. We live in the worst of times and the best of times. I just came back from a city on the other side of the globe that has 21 million people living in it. The rule there politically is one order, one act. They built a bullet train that goes from one end of the country to the other in less than a year. That trip used to take 6 hours by car, train, boat, truck. The bullet train was built in less than a year, and it goes in 70 minutes from point A to point B. There is no race when we talk about superpowers operating in the world right now. Let me tell you, when you do it on that level, when the analysis is on the level of what a society can produce. I saw a play performed entirely on the surface of a lake in November with lights and boats and people running across the surface of the water. Okay. There is no understanding, I think, in this country about how we are positioned right now. There is just no understanding. Those of you that have families in other parts of the world have some sense of our positioning. So the next political cycle is going to be very, very interesting in my view. And the next sort of opportunity for discourse is enormously important. It's going to happen in cyberspace. It's going to happen in real face-to-face opportunity. It's going to happen through books. It's going to happen through blogs. And the trick will be whether or not you remember this or this, and whether or not, I mean, this is just my opinion. It doesn't count for squat. It's just you invited me here, I'm on this panel, I'm expressing an opinion. So to remember as you're going through all this information, am I this, left over right, or am I right over left? Do I know somebody that's the other? Do I have a chance to process this stuff that I'm seeing and what I ultimately think? And what you ultimately then do, I would suggest to you, is not going to be prescribed anywhere. We have to start understanding what is right and what is wrong and move with that. But we have to move with it in a way that is gentle. The other way, to be brutal about it, to be mean-spirited about it, to be unkind at every moment, you lose that and you could invite disaster. I have made mistakes even as I moved into this space of trying to displace the power of violence in society. In my own small way, continue to be very violent. And I try to at least be conscious of it so I don't repeat it again, right? So you never have the opportunity, I would say to you, to do it again. It only comes once. Even the exchange of a glance with another person, you only have that opportunity once. We collectively only have this opportunity now to move in the proper way. And I am looking to leadership like MPAC, which holds the space, really, for the middle way. My teacher used to say to me, Angela, you know what the trick in life is? We try to walk as straight a path as we can down a very crooked road called life. That's what MPAC is trying to do, right? I think, organizationally. That has always been my impression of the organization and the leadership that I have met from here.
Thank you, Angela. Salam. I wanted to get to Madison, but I just wanted to get a response from Rashad in terms of how do we deal with these marginalized communities right now?
Well, addressing this question of rise in sentiment against religion, and certainly we've seen it with regard to anti-Semitism, anti-Islamic sentiments. The conflation of terrorism and Islam is something that's dangerous. It's something that feeds the narrative of terrorists who will point to those who say that there's a link between the two and say, see, they're again arguing that Islam and terrorism are the same. And so therefore there's no way of bridging this divide. And that's something that we have tried to be very clear about. And going back to Cairo, when the president made very clear that when it comes to this issue of violent extremism, Islam is totally opposed to it. Not only in Cairo, but after the massacre at Fort Hood, after the attempted terrorist attack on December 25th, again after the attempted terrorist attack in Times Square. We've made this point very clear again and again. And with regard to this question about otherization, as I stated earlier, it's important that when you look at particular religious communities, you keep in mind that of course there's a unique set of issues, but at the end of the day, the fundamental aspirations, the fundamental concerns are the same. And so to engage on the basis of those. And when the president talked about this issue on Eid Day at a press conference on the economy, he said, we have to be careful when we're talking about distinct communities like Muslim communities whose kids are going to school with our kids, as he said, who are our co-workers. He said that I've got troops that are fighting alongside each other in Afghanistan, some of whom are Muslim and some of whom are not. And what is it saying when we act as if somehow Islam is in and of itself offensive? And I think taking this point head on of otherization, he said, when it comes to these issues, there's no them and us. It's just us. And so from a government perspective, of course, I think it's important to counter this narrative of Islam somehow being conflated with terrorism. It's important to counter, this narrative of the other. And then as communities work together, such as in this conference, it's important for communities to work together in coalition. It's important for, we've talked a lot about, in terms of solutions, civic engagement, Muslim communities working on issues that are of importance to all communities. The Ummah Clinic right here, for example, in Los Angeles, which provides healthcare and services to people regardless of their religious faith. That type of engagement is something that, can transcend these barriers of religion and race and ethnicity. And those are some of the areas of partnership that we've also tried to establish. And that'll be, very important at a time when, when you have the increase in numbers and visibility of certain communities, including Muslim communities, that we are able to achieve what we've achieved in the past in America. When you look at the question of this conference, what is the history of the United States? The history of the United States is a proud tradition of tolerance winning over. Whether that's with African American communities, whether that's with Jewish communities, Irish communities, with Hispanic communities, Asian American communities. And so that is a challenge that we face. And one of the reasons why I remain optimistic despite challenges is because I see movement, in the right direction in some of the areas that I described before, but also really because of youth. And that's something that, I think MPAC has really focused on. I come at this from a little bit of different perspective. We have, in my college years and in law school and graduate school, just like in any other topics, late-night conversations about philosophy, late-night conversations about religion, and the experience of young Americans growing up in the generation of young people that's growing up now, that are growing up and going to school with Muslims, playing sports with Muslims, being involved in all types of projects, community service projects, and other endeavors with Muslims. They see Islam, I think, in a different way, perhaps, than many Americans saw it just 20 or 30 years ago. That's not to say that there wasn't a strong Muslim presence that was, engaged at that period too. But if you look at the numbers and the shifts in the demographics and the number of students that are studying in universities and organized in different communities of religion and working together and chaplaincies that we now see in Islam and Muslims being integrated in universities, not only do you have a future core group of Muslims that has had different interactions than the ones we've seen just 20 or 30 years ago, but they're fellow leaders of the future that will also lead this country. They have a very different understanding of Islam and Muslims that we saw, not too long ago in this country as well. So I think, you asked about solutions. I think part of it is that there is a natural movement that will occur, I think, in the right direction that is occurring, but that's not enough. That's not sufficient. It's not appropriate to just say, let's just wait it out and things will get better. There are very real things that can be done in terms of civic engagement, participation, coalition building, and the elimination of this idea that somehow Islam condones terrorism. To continue to work towards that issue, for Muslim communities to continue to work on that issue, and for other communities to continue to acknowledge that and recognize that, and dialogue through that idea will continue to be important.
Thank you.
I just wanted to tag on to Angie's comment, and I'm glad Mr. Hussain got to go before me because I want to tie them together. I haven't seen the WikiLeaks memo either, but I agree that a deal was struck regarding the DREAM Act and Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So my point is, why one and not the other? I don't think it was you can have one but not both. Pick one. I think that this engagement question is key. That our congregation, Pilgrim United Church of Christ, is one of those that we call an open and affirming congregation to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered persons. And what I've learned through pastoring a church with that experience is that those are conversations that are hard to deny within a family. Look at Dick Cheney's family. That the impact of Don't Ask, Don't Tell is not just on the military. It is an impact on the humanity of every gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender person in this culture. And those conversations are hard not to have. We avoid them, but there's more opportunity because in every family, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, there are persons who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, somewhere in your extended family or in your family tree. And so for those who voted for Don't Ask, Don't Tell, whether they acknowledge it or not, those are conversations they've had and recognizing the impact on people that they love and care about. When you come to questions of immigration from Mexico, then the conversation is, well, I don't know anybody. There's nobody in my family that's going to be impacted as directly as Don't Ask, Don't Tell and what it means for the whole society. And so what you're saying about engagement is key. And so when there's no one on the other side of that conversation, and all of this insane, maddening conspiracy theories and birther theories and takeover theories go unchecked by by a dialogue partner, we are in a very dangerous space. So in many people's minds who subscribe to this American exceptionalist ideology, moderate Muslims, if they exist, doesn't matter. Because moderate Muslims and terrorist Muslims simply have different strategies to the same goal, which is domination. And they feel that this domination is happening, whether it's in Sharia laws that are going to take over our court system. And when you were saying one mosque when you were a child and 43 now and you're still a child, wow, that sounds like domination to me. That when they project that acceleration of the expansion of the presence, and they look at themselves and their own impotence. And the fact is that Christianity as a whole is in a long, slow decline in its proportion of adherence within American culture. And so they sense that and they feel this decline. And even though Islam is a very small group, they see it on the rise. And when you go to 1 to 43, the rate of increase is astronomical. And so they latch on to these things and they feel that the only way to salve their feelings of impotence is to strike out at people that they feel threaten that ultimately.
That's right. Bob?
Well, first... Yeah. First of all, I would say, for the most part, we deal with these problems by focusing on the head. I disagree with that. I think we ought to start with the hand. And by that, what I mean is, when our congregations came together, sitting down and talking about the Quran, the Torah, and the New Testament, and debating that was not going to get us anywhere at all. So we had a woman's cooking class, and we've learned to eat halal food in my home, and you still get fat eating that. But we've done that. The men came together. We're building houses together. And what happens is, when you sweat together and you're working on common problems in the community, you get close to people. And you know what? It's hard to take a shot at someone that you're friends with. So I'm about to take the imam deer hunting in East Texas. I've told him he can't wear his Pakistani cap and outfit. A Muslim imam running through East Texas thickets with that attire and a rifle might get shot. So he's assured me he'll wear jeans and a T-shirt, so I'm going to take him. But I believe the key, I really am, and we're going to eat it. It's not pork. But I believe the key has got to be building relationships, and that's not what we've done. And here's the need of the day. The need of the day is not for more academics, intellectuals, geopolitical people to sit down and talk. It's for people who have the power of the masses, the clerics, to do more than just preach sermons, but to mobilize their congregations and say, hey, I don't agree with you. Theologically, I don't accept Muhammad as the prophet. If I did, I would be a Muslim. I don't disrespect him. I'm on the Quran now for the third time trying to understand it. The Imam, we go back and forth. Better not go there. But anyhow, we have conversations, but it's based on what are we doing to build our city together. We're pluralistic in every other way. As an evangelical, the idea of talking to someone of a different faith almost is a compromise of your faith. It shouldn't be. I mean, if anything, if I'm going to be more literal in my translation and understanding of the Bible and what Jesus said, I love people all the more. But I would agree with Miss O on two or three accounts. First of all, I think we're really talking about an issue of immigration. I mean, you think about whether it's Muslims coming to America or the Muslim faith emerging in America or it's Hispanics. So the question is, how do we handle migration? Because that's one of the great conversations of the world. And I think the Chinese really do have a huge lesson, because Chinese don't always tell you what they're thinking. I work in East China, in East Asia, but they smile. And so I'm very serious about this. Chinese prosper all over the world like no other people group on the face of the earth. Why? It's how they handle their difficulties. You don't know about it. And I think it's kind of like Gandhi one time was coming into this village and he saw this man who committed to nonviolence, and he's sitting there, he's about to, be beaten, and he's afraid he's going to die, and he looks very sad and forlorn. And Gandhi looks at him and said, "What's wrong with you?" He says, "I'm about to suffer." He said, "Look, if you can't stand up for truth and smile and be happy about it, just go home. You do our cause no good." So the point is, in the midst of your struggle, smile. Even if you're hurting on the inside, smile. Suck it up. Move your feet forward. That's what I tell my kids. If they're hurting, smile. Because people who smile, it's hard to throw rocks. Now, I also want to agree with Miss O. I'm very optimistic about Muslim relations in America. I know y'all may think I'm crazy, but I really am. Let me tell you why. We're using the wrong yardstick to measure it. We're saying it's like when the Catholic came. No, it's not. That's like Sunnis and Shia getting together. It's not. We may not get along real good, but ultimately we're going to do it. Neither is it like the Irish or the Italians coming. They were Europeans. Here's what you have to compare it to. Please don't be offended by this. But we're just having a conversation, right? Let's throw a little gas on this thing. Have some fun. All right. The reality is...
You already went to deer hunting, so why not?
Why not? Here's the reality. If you want to understand Muslim relations, it's like I heard a Muslim scholar. He and I were speaking in Europe not long ago. He blew me away. I thought, this guy's right on. He said, most Americans thought of Muslims, they thought of Muhammad Ali. Well, we like Muhammad Ali. And then we thought of Iran. And we thought, well, that scared us a little bit. And then we began to see what was going on in the Middle East. That really scared us. And then after 9/11, it hit us hard. Don't compare how people are responding to Islam like Catholics or Irish. Instead, you have to think in terms of Pearl Harbor.
Right.
Stay with me why I say that. Here's why. What you had was the first attack on American continental soil since 1812. So you've got a lot of Americans who are open-minded, but now they see this. It scares them to death. They're thinking, oh my word, is this all Muslims? And so the result of that is there's a tremendous amount of fear. Christine Amanpour was interviewing Ibu Patel, and I was overseas, and I tried to text him. I couldn't get it to him. And she said, Ibu, you've done all this work, and nothing's changed in the last 10 years. Are you disappointed? And I wanted him to say, no, I'm excited. Think about it. We have no internment camps. Think about it. No internment camps. We have, and you list all the things that happened to the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. It was horrible. And yet the reality is, it's not better, I agree, but it's not worse. And so it's like Fernando said, ultimately, your place is coming. And I agree with you, Rashad. We can't be still and we can't ignore it. And I think the onus is on the majority. Frankly, people like me who are opening their churches and saying, hey, we want to get to know you, we want to get along. The thing I would say is when we do that, please come. We're not going to shoot you or we might try to baptize you, but you can't hold that against us. I mean, that's just kind of who we are. I mean, I've had many Muslims try to convert me. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just, we exchange ideas about everything else. We can't talk about God. So I know it's hard, but I think you're at a turning point in a healthy way. And see, all right, we're just talking, so don't get upset with me, but like most Americans, when they hear people come on television, do you realize the impact of somebody like Reem or somebody like Rashad, who's on the camera instead of a first-generation immigrant? All of a sudden, Americans can handle that. And close with this one story about our friend Suhail Khan. Suhail is a second-generation American Muslim Indian. He's a very good friend of mine. Love him to death. He's in and out of our home. Lives in D.C. and has worked with the government, worked with President Bush. So I brought him to my church one Sunday. And so his hair's slicked back. He wears cowboy boots, dark complected. So I get him up in front of our whole church, and I said, and I didn't call him by his name. I said, I like your cowboy boots. He said, yeah, I like these too. You can't beat a pair of Lucchese's. Well, Texas, you have to understand what Lucchese is. So everybody, he must be cool. What's your favorite music? Oh, I love Johnny Cash. Whoa. So you must be some Baptist Mexican who worked with President Bush, right? And so he goes, so Suhail goes, no, I'm an Indian from California who's a Muslim. Everybody died laughing. They thought it was a joke. Well, it wasn't a joke. But here's what freaked him out. Bobby talks like us. He likes country music. And what they were experiencing that we've not seen a lot of was second-generation American Muslims that they could relate to. And they thought, it's what you were talking about.
Reem, what do you think? Pearl Harbor?
You disagree.
I disagree. I first have to contextualize my words. I actually put my right thumb over my left, so it's a lot here. It's not.
That's why you're a civil rights lawyer.
Yeah.
Not a corporate lawyer.
I don't think the bar is Pearl Harbor. I don't think that the way we can look at from a Muslim living, growing up in this environment, I don't think the way for me to see that everything is okay is because I wasn't thrown into a concentration camp. But that's very hard for me to digest, and for me to working with Muslims to say, it's fine as long as you're not in a concentration camp, you're A-okay. That said, I am optimistic, but I'm also very strategically optimistic. I think that there's so much that needs to be done within our community and across communities. I do see immigration. That's a huge, huge concern, and I think that what we're going to see in this next term, the next few years, is this continuation of the politics of fear, where there will be a conflation of terrorism, immigration, and unfortunately Islam. Well, all three are going to be conflated, and that's going to not only affect, obviously, the Muslim community, but it's going to affect the Latino communities and many other communities of color. And so really, I think for us as a Muslim community and across communities, how can we work with one another? How can the Muslim community work with the Christian community and the Jewish community and other communities, other ethnic communities, in order to address this problem that we are still in America. We are still in this very nativist, exceptionalist state where we are constantly fueled by fear. And how can we stop this fear from allowing policies that are emerging every day, allowing these policies that are being selectively enforced on certain populations to the exclusion of other populations that are now trickling down into the private sector, and where we are seeing now in the Muslim community the highest level of employment discrimination ever, more so now than after September 11th, where we're seeing more hate crimes now than before. How can we really, that is something that I think that we need to start thinking about, is strategically how can we undermine the fear that is constantly being fed to the American populace, that is allowing for continued very, very explicit bigoted statements and targeting of populations based on not what I as an individual am doing or what Rashad is doing or what you, Salam, are doing, but based on this notion that Islam and Muslims is equated to a certain, group of people across overseas that, frankly, I've never ever I've never met, and I don't think I will ever meet. And so for me, as somebody who's, still relatively young, that is something that I really want to see growing up, continuing in this country and working on from a civil rights and civil liberties perspective. How can we really undermine the sense of fear and using the rule of law to do that? I think that's absolutely fundamental, and not taking Pearl Harbor as a standard, but taking the fact that I am an American and I have constitutional rights and I have the rights of due process, equal protection, etc. That is my standard. That is what I look at. I don't look at the other experiences of minorities. I look at what I have a right to and what I'm going to aspire to.
So I need to respond to this
also,
because
we're going to be taking questions, so please write down your questions and give it to the ushers, and we'll be taking your questions in this next part of our session. Go ahead, Angela.
So I need to respond because I feel this passion coming. And it's righteous passion, by the way. But a man named Frank Emmy died last week. He's 93 years old. He's a Japanese-American camp internee from World War II. He was what we call a no-no boy. After they interned all of the Japanese Americans after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, over a period of time, of course, politics. People are political. So politics plays out in the camps. And question 21 and 22, or 22 and 23, 27, 28. I knew it was in the 20s. So the first asks for you to forswear any allegiance to any other government but the United States of America. And the second asks you to fight for this country. So it was not popular to answer no, but those who did were labeled the no-no boys. And they were ridiculed, beaten, called traitors. Their rationale was, how can I answer yes to these questions? My own government has just put me in camp. Now they want me to go out and possibly die when my sisters, brothers, wives, sisters, uncles are all still in camp with no due process. I do believe it's possible for a society to become hysterical and make bad decisions again, even this one. So, in fact, I think what is very clear and heartens me is that the leaders of the redress and reparations movement were among the first to support efforts to organize and give voice to a different analysis than what was coming through the mainstream media after 9/11. But Emmy was only recognized as a man of honor much, much, much later in life. Guys like him were marginalized, hardly ever spoke of the experience to his own family members throughout his life. The kind of courage that it takes to file as plaintiff named in a lawsuit, the kind of courage that it takes to, within an agency that's going down a path on a policy that you know in your gut is wrong, to say, no, this isn't right, and I will not be complicit in this. The kind of courage that it takes to speak up in a workplace, to say this is not right, I'm not going to be complicit, and I'm not going, is enormous. The job of new leaders is not to give more information, not to give necessarily skill. Leaders, I'm not talking about people who are managing an organization, or that's the one kind, but I'm talking leaders. You must know how to give fearlessness to other people. That is the greatest gift that you can give, fearlessness. And so, what I want to just say is that in the government papers that were unearthed by Dale and the Asian Law Caucus guys in the 80s, they found the government saying things like, we just can't tell the wheat from the chaff, the goats from the sheep. They knowingly, the United States Attorney's Office and the generals, the admiral, who knew the intelligence data were telling them no evidence of espionage on the West Coast. They knowingly suppressed it so that 120,000 people were ripped from their homes. And they've never really been properly redressed. You go down to Palos Verdes Estates, most of that was Japanese farmland, strawberry fields. Those people never got their land back. You know how much that property is worth today in Southern California, right? So, I mean, I just, want to thank you for doing this work, because you're mostly going to be rejected and you're mostly going to lose as a civil rights lawyer. It has been that way since civil rights litigation has happened. Brown v. Board of Education did not happen because Thurgood Marshall was such a brilliant lawyer. It happened because there were historians, there were psychologists, there were educators, there were community organizers. They all made it possible. And the stars were aligned to happen just at that moment. It had already been tried before right here in Southern California with the Mexicanos who tried to get desegregation and integration. It had already happened with Gangnam v. Rice in Mississippi in the 1800s. Thurgood Marshall got lucky because all of the stars were aligned and people ready to move. You have to see yourself in context. You are part of a much larger movement in the universe. We are living in a time of spiritual awakening. Your base is one that calls upon your spirituality to guide you. Not your brain, not your degrees, not your business, not your bank account, not your influence, whatever you think that is, but your spirit, your human spirit to guide you. So you all take a piece of it. Some are healers, some are advocates, some are political, some are mothers and fathers and grandparents. But every piece has to be happening. And consciously now, I am consciously calling on people to recognize this in all of the work that we do. I should be in a Korean community-based organization. I should be a civil rights lawyer still. I should be on the bench. I should be so many things that other people tell me what I should be. But where do I find myself? In a nonprofit dedicated to building peace. How did that happen? It's not because I get a better paycheck than when I was in Century City as a lawyer, let me tell you. Right? So we have to have the courage to follow what our intuition is telling us right now, because everything else not going to take us true north. Our intuition will take us true north. You have to trust it. You have to have the courage to go with that.
Thank you, Angela. There are many questions. We're only going to be able to get to a few of them. And then hopefully we'll save the rest, and maybe we can have all of you answer the questions online on the MPAC website. One of the questions is, and I think going back to what Angela was talking about, the next 2 years is going to be a roller coaster ride for a lot of us. One of the changes that's going to happen because of a Republican-led House of Representatives is that a man by the name of Peter King is going to be the chair of the Homeland Security Committee. And some people feel that he is going to have a McCarthy-like set of hearings for the next 2 years, basically bringing on Muslims and telling them that they are tied to terrorists, the conflation that we're talking about, that because they are actively involved as Muslims, therefore they must have ties to terrorism. And so the question is, what should Muslim Americans be doing about it? And we talked about coalition building. We talked about positioning ourselves in terms of the kind of issues that we should be raising. There is the issue of real terrorist plots by Abdul Muttalib, Faisal Shahzad, Nidal Hasan that we should also be concerned about, as well as the sting operations that Reem had raised. So who would like to discuss these issues that are going to be coming up in the Homeland Security Committee for the next 2 years, which definitely will have a political motivation as we get ready for the next presidential race for 2012?
I mean, the main narrative is going to be to place again, like Angela says, it's all about politics and electoral gain. And if there's one thing, is that the Republicans obviously want to capture the White House, want to capture the Senate, strengthen their position in the U.S. House, and they will use their powers to try to position themselves as those that protect American security. And it's easy to scapegoat certain groups, and we've seen it before, and it's going to happen. And so how do we prepare for that? How do we make sure that it doesn't become effective? And some of it is not to play into their hands, but a lot of it is to develop coalitions. And you know, there are a lot of allies because they see this as a challenge. The Democrats themselves are not going to want this to happen for a variety of different reasons. The Republicans are going to try to make themselves the ones that protect America. Not only protect America from foreign powers, but protect America to look the way America looked 20 years ago. We all know that's impossible, but that's what they're going to try to do, and it's going to be very difficult. There are many reasonable Republicans who are not going to want to play into that, but they're going to be forced to play into that, as we see it today in terms of the defeat of the DREAM Act or others by the right wing. And interesting, from a political analysis, the more that the Republicans are pushed to the right, the less likely they are to actually capture the White House and capture many of the Senate seats. But it's this very interesting dialogue that they're going to be playing. I think the civil rights community and the ability of civil rights lawyers to try to have the American institutions play by the rules is a good strategy. Sometimes it's a long-term strategy. It's difficult, but that's a good strategy right there as well.
Okay, anybody subpoenaed has to get counsel. That counsel has to refuse to let their client testify. They send a letter. They say, thank you very much. We'll decline the opportunity to appear. That has to happen as a practical matter. Otherwise, once you're in there, you're on the record under oath, and they can play with you. And believe me, when Senate holds hearing, the staff have done major prep. They know all about you. They know all about you before you come in. So the questions become very pointed and difficult. The other thing, parallel should be happening, is you have organized bar associations all across the country. They need to have their antenna up about this if it's for real going to happen. The other thing that should happen is that you should get Equal Justice Works, you should get Equal Justice Society. These are groups that are very much advocates of civil rights and civil liberties. They will mobilize. It's a different era.
Madison? Yeah, if I heard the question correctly, what should Muslims do? I reject the premise of the question. It's not for Muslims to do anything other than American Muslims, Muslim Americans, as I like to say, have always done. Just be who you are. It's to say what should we do suggests that something you have done has brought this circumstance about, and I reject that. And that was one reason why I know we're having fun and we're talking, but the Pearl Harbor analogy was very disturbing to me. This notion that this collective guilt should be imposed on random American citizens for what some random other people did. It wasn't even the action of a particular government.
What I was trying to say was that we didn't respond in the same hysterical, extremist manner. Please don't hear me saying it was great. You're not in concentration camps. Congratulations. That is not what I was saying. Yeah. What I was saying is we did not respond in the same extremist manner that we have in the past.
Well, not in that strategy. I still refer it as hysterical. But my point is that the real point, the answer is we, all of us who are Americans, all of us have to claim this as a problem for America. We've got to say that this focus, this hysteria, this mass hysteria is tearing our country apart. It's making us less safe. It's undermining our ability to harness the resources of American children who want to make a contribution, be they of Mexican-American heritage or Mexican heritage, and you can't even call it Islamic heritage. It's a religion. And again, not to pick on you, but just to say that America, like Muhammad Ali, 30 years later. When Muhammad Ali changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, America hated Muhammad Ali. When he just denied the draft and refused to fight in Vietnam, America hated Muhammad Ali. And when they thought of Islam and Muhammad Ali, they thought of Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. It took a long time before Muhammad Ali became domesticated enough in that dimension for America to embrace him. The ultimate thing is about the willingness for America to change its perspective on who the hell it thinks it is. And whether or not we can exist in this world respecting other nations, cultures, peoples, faiths, and live both in the world and in our society with an acceptance that we are not everything, and not everyone has to become like us in order to be acceptable human beings. That we live here in this diversity, and that this diversity is in fact our strength, and this diversity is what makes America exceptional.
All right, thank you. Yeah, you can chime in, but there's a question to you from the web, from Khurram Zaman in Maryland. Wants to ask, why does the American Muslim community seem resistant to accepting the notion that there are homegrown terrorists among us? How can we stop youth from radicalization?
Before I answer that question, I just had something very quick to say about Peter King. These committees that he wants to set up. You know, I think it's very ironic that he's looking into this stuff. I mean, I was looking at his own background, and in fact, he's somebody who supported the IRA, which is a terrorist organization in the 1980s. He actually financed them, and he ran guns for them. So it's very interesting that now he's turning around and trying to figure out. The reason he broke ranks with them, ironically, in 2005 was because the Irish didn't support the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's the reason why he broke ranks with them. So I think it's very ironic that he's turning around now and wanting to do this McCarthy-like investigation of the Muslim community. But, you know, and again, this is a very quick comment before I answer this question. I think that the most powerful thing that I've seen in the past few years was the SB 1070, how the country came together. Mm-hmm. I thought that was incredible, and I hope that if something like this comes around, if Representative King is actually successful in setting up these committees, that the whole country can come together and say, not on our watch, we're not necessarily Muslims, but we are not going to allow the scapegoating of a certain population for your own benefit and to promote this politics of fear. So I really hope that we can recreate the SB 1070 environment at that time. As far as the question that was just asked to me, you know, there is a resistance. I do agree that there is a resistance to accepting this notion of homegrown terrorism, and I think part of it, I was just looking at, before I came here, I was looking at some statistics, and the study by the Center on Law and Security in NYU actually had this study where they said that out of the 156 prosecutions, terrorism prosecutions, 97 of them involved FBI agents, informers, and agent provocateurs. And so there is a concern, I think, within the Muslim community that a lot of the stuff that we're seeing now is being either promoted, staged, or enhanced through the involvement of law enforcement. And unfortunately, Eric Holder recently came out and said that he does not have a problem, and he supports what the FBI is currently doing. And there is a problem. I mean, clearly, you know, Muslims are like any other population. There are criminals amongst us. There are good guys. There's bad guys. But the problem is what is the government doing, and how is the federal, FBI and agent provocateurs, what are they doing to enhance this narrative that really ties together this notion of homegrown of Islam and terror? And when you have individuals who are clearly disenfranchised and who are clearly on the fringes, it is very troubling for me. I'm thinking specifically, for example, of the Portland, the Somali kid in Portland. He was somebody who was very, very disenfranchised, somebody whose family was going through a divorce, and his father ended up calling the feds on him. And so the feds came in, and at that point, you know, a few months later, he was trying to basically blow up this square in Portland. What exactly, I mean, that is very concerning, where you have somebody who is disenfranchised. Why do we as a Muslim community not have centers for at-risk youth? Because there are at-risk youth in our communities, and it seems that when they are taken through the law enforcement route, they become subjects of terrorism, and they become part of this terrorism narrative. So there is a resistance, and I think that resistance it's not realistic. We do have problems within our community, but there is a tremendous amount of fear that I see and concern that I have with the level of interest of our community and the suspect nature of our community that's really being promoted and promulgated by the intelligence community as well.
Okay. Back to, I guess, somebody from the Muslim groups. I am a Christian and a female. What can regular citizens like me do to bridge the tribal gap? As a woman, I feel intimidated among Muslims. Then I may be rejected and or my ideas not be as valuable as a male. Overall, this is an American problem too.
Well, there's always stereotypes about Muslims and very similar stereotypes amongst Latinos that we are male-dominating and overbearing and don't allow women to take leadership roles. But as we all know, and as you all know out there, that nothing could be further from the truth. Just some very specific data. There are 7 Latino members of Congress from the state of California. 5 of them are women. In the state legislature about 4 years ago, the last time I have the data, there were 10, there's only 40 state senators in California. 10 of those are Latino, 5 of them are women. Today in the LA school board, the largest school board, the second largest school board in the nation, a budget of over $6 billion. There's 7 school board members. 3 of them are Latinos. All 3 of them are women. Women have a role, and you could do the same thing in African American community. Of the 3 members of Congress from LA, all 3 of them are women. And so the idea that quote unquote non-white communities, Muslims, blacks, Latinos, Asians, dominate their women and don't let them take leadership position, those groups together actually have more women in power in California than white communities do. So nothing could be further from the truth in terms of that stereotype.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add? To Reverend Roberts, are the fears of the right wing about Islam real, or to spread fears and win the elections?
I'm not afraid of Muslims. So, I mean, we have terrorists that are Muslims, and we have terrorists are not limited to a particular race. So, I don't fear Muslims. I teach our people not to fear Muslims. When we had in our church, we had the Muslims and the Jews come over. I did have some people get nervous. Well, what are we doing for screening? Is this safe and so forth? We just had But we're in Texas. Everybody has guns there, especially white people. So, but we had a global faith forum at our church. We expected 200 or 300 people. We had over 700. And the impact of that was phenomenal as people just got to know one another. And I think the biggest challenge there is we don't know Muslims or, people that are different from our background. And so when we get to know them, that tension comes down. I do think there are people... I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, there. Here we go. Come on, testing 1, 2, 3. I'll quote some Bible verses or something. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the wrong thing. Okay, I'm sorry.
Keep going.
Okay, I would just say. I don't buy it that I'm afraid of Muslims. I think it hurts not just the Muslim community. I think it hurts the broader community when we live in fear of people. We are a nation with a rule of law, and I think we can count on that to prevail.
Okay. I agree that civic engagement is key and is something I advocate in my own work. However, it's my sense that Muslim communities tend to isolate themselves and are reluctant to let themselves be known. We need to do some internal advocacy. Also, more young Muslims should be entering fields of media, journalism, politics. I guess he's complaining that there are too many Muslim doctors. Rashad.
Well, I would add sports to that, too.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe Muhammad Ali isn't a great example, but if you look at someone like Zinedine Zidane in France, nobody asks him there, where are you from, even though he's ethnically Algerian. And the transformative impact that a young athlete can have by entering the homes of people all across the country is something, the importance of which can't be overstated. And, the same thing is true, I think, of the arts and entertainment, where, I think much of the advocacy on issues oftentimes affecting Muslim communities goes towards Washington, when in reality it's really the people across the country, the people in Middle America, that have a lot of the questions that need to be addressed. And so, activism in all of these fields, participation in all these fields, including sports, the arts, as you said, I do see a strong increase in civic engagement through organizations such as the Ummah Clinic, organizations such as Iman in Chicago, which provides services again with people's religious affiliation. And it's not only Muslims that are working there, but side by side with communities of other faith as well. So I do agree with that sentiment, but I also want to add the caution that I don't think it's quite fair to look at Muslim communities and say that, broadly speaking, that engagement is not occurring. Because I think that engagement is occurring at a number of levels, and it's oftentimes not recognized. On the question, going back to the issue of violent extremism, Muslim communities are condemning terrorism. They are condemning violent extremism. Major Muslim organizations have been doing that for years and years and years. Major Muslim American thought leaders, major scholars. You can look at people across not only this country but around the world. People, with the requisite qualifications to issue rulings in this area have been largely unequivocal that Islam is opposed to terrorism. So I also wanted to add one point, going back to the previous discussion, is that how is it then that we continue to have some of these cases that are occurring when clearly the vast overwhelming majority of Muslims have condemned it, the leadership has condemned it, it's been condemned as something that is anti-Islamic? Well, it's because there is a small group of people that is using sophisticated means, including social media, new media, that is exploiting the grievances of young people and getting to them in very sophisticated ways. And in addition to civic engagement and participation in all aspects of society, I think it's also important, going back to this question of what can be done, the question that you got from Maryland, that Muslim communities also continue to engage in sophisticated means to address this question and make it clear that there is no grievance, no policy grievance whatsoever that justifies the killing of innocent people. And I think that, as Muslim communities continue to do that in sophisticated ways, as they continue to engage through civic engagement and other activities, whether it's arts, whether it's sports, whether it's entertainment, in all these fields that you mentioned, I think that'll continue to be important and will be important not only in addressing some of the sentiment that we've seen, but of course addressing the very real problem that I think that we have to acknowledge does exist, which is a problem of terrorism that must be eradicated from all communities.
Thank you. And I agree with you. There definitely is a problem of an extremist ideology that takes on an Islamic veneer to gain popularity among Muslims. And many young Muslims through the internet are being exposed to this problem. So MPAC has taken it upon itself to deal with this issue. And I believe that the next panel is going to cover this issue of ideology and theology in a much more elaborate manner. So I really welcome everyone to come to the next panel to talk about this issue of extremist ideology and Muslim Americans and scholars dealing with this problem. Pastor Madison, many people called President Obama's election as a movement in America towards a post-racial society, but there's a difference between post-racial and post-racist. Are we in a post-racist society, and should we be moving towards a post-racial society? And if you can explain the difference for us.
Good question. I'm not sure I can say the difference, but I would actually say we're in neither. That we're still in a racist society. That the election...
And that takes care of it. Thank you.
No, the election of President Obama was a historic and wonderful and great moment for America. There's no question about that. But he has a unique set of personal qualities that I've written about that allowed him to succeed in this election. And his biracial background is not the least of them. And so I see Obama as a bridge toward a less racist society. The real and ultimate challenge is when we can see each other in our difference and still be okay. Zinedine Zidane is probably, like you say, more French than Algerian. And so the moment that these celebrities, including Obama, come into our living room, they lose their differentness. And that makes them acceptable and also exceptional. And they leave their group behind to suffer still the racism and discrimination that's heaped upon them. And I'm telling you, black folks have experienced this for a long time. You know, I've often lived biculturally, gone to white schools and so forth, and they'll say to me, "Oh, but you're different," you know. and so what we need to do is to not lose ourselves as we engage others so that they'll like us, but to be who we are and really force the question of, can you accept someone who is different within a diverse culture and accept the gifts of that differentness? And finally, the problem with, again, so much emphasis on the Muslim community and their responsibilities and how they engage. Engagement is key. I don't deny that. But there simply aren't enough Muslims to engage all the people in the country. You know, there just simply aren't enough to have a Bible study with. And those who lead Muslim congregations have other responsibilities than talking to, you know, Christian pastors about why they shouldn't hate Muslims. And so it really has to be something we own as a real problem of racism, of discrimination, of xenophobia that we as a society have to solve. And one thing that was on the title but we really haven't talked about, and the Muhammad Ali analogy gets a little bit at it, is the ethnic dimension of this. I've always teased you about, you know, the fact that many studies show that half of the Muslims in America are black or African American. But when white America looks at any of the current athletes or with Islamic names, some of them do it for personal reasons, others, you know, are Muslims. America doesn't see them in the same category as we're talking about on this panel today. They don't see them as terrorists. They see them as black folks who, you know, whatever they are, you know, in terms of their religion, they see them as athletes and so forth. So there is an ethnic dimension that we've totally missed today that makes this problem and this question much more complicated, even as complicated as it is. And so I just wanted to not solve it, but throw it out there. But
yeah.
One point I'll add on the issue of civic engagement. You know, part of the power of civic engagement, which I think is very important for Muslim communities at this time, is that it allows Muslim communities to tell an affirmative story of who they are. And so they're talking about and acting out what it means to be Muslim, and not always talking about what Islam isn't. Instead, they're working together with other communities and acting in a way which they believe is inspired by their faith. And they're living out what Islam is. And that means, you know, to many, as I mentioned, programs such as the Ummah Clinic or the Inner City Muslim Action Network. And so, you know, as you said, it's a bit unfair to say that the primary job of Muslim communities is to constantly just play defense and condemn what a small fraction of the community is doing. And the communities have largely done that, you know, overwhelmingly. But there is an importance to, you know, of course, telling the story in an affirmative way, creating that affirmative discourse, and civic engagement is one of the ways of doing that.
I actually just want to say something really quickly about what you were saying, Madison. I'm glad you talked about the divide, the racial divide within the Muslim community. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now a lot is that whenever we talk about Muslims or Islam, the media talks about Muslims and Islam, they just look at the immigrant populations. They don't look at African Americans. But unfortunately, even, one thing that's really also struck me is that even when there is an expose of African Americans, I'm thinking specifically of the case of Imam Luqman in Detroit, and that he was again framed within the lens of terrorism because, again, they had to connect him back to Islam and the whole rhetoric and narrative behind Islam. And so there is still, unfortunately, even despite the racial divide, there's still that connecting narrative that unfortunately, that we really need to try to work on. And I'm very glad to hear the ownership that you are taking as an individual in your community to try to work on that behalf. I think it is very important that other communities also support and work, and our community supports and works with other communities on the various issues that we're all facing.
Well, we're going to take that question, I think, and also send that to the next panel in terms of ethnic makeup of the Muslim American community, African American component of our Muslim American community, because we'll have both in the next panel, and they will have an introspective look at some of the issues that we have been talking about. I think this has been quite an eye-opening panel. We have discussed a number of issues, namely the issues of change and how we all have to be repositioning ourselves to have a discussion about this issue. The issue of which thumb goes on top, the right or the left, in terms of using both reason and the heart. The issue of demographic shifts and some of the political issues that our political leaders, unfortunately, will trade off our rights, not just civil rights, but our human rights, and throw us a bone once in a while to appease us, to think that there is change being made. But most importantly, what I think this panel represented is a cross-section of America, a cross-section of who we are. And that regardless of our ethnic background, regardless of our religious background, what we are committed to is justice. And if there's injustice against anyone, violence against gays and lesbians, against Jews, against Christians, against Muslims, against African Americans, Latinos, if there's marginalization against anyone, we stand together in unison in saying that that is wrong, and we stand together in unison in saying that the greatness of America and the greatness of where we all come from is working together for justice. So thank you very much for sharing.
For these children, our children, and for all of America's children,